Well, what were your most salient points?
Well, I really wanted to talk about how, as a video game developer, I do have a unique perspective on understanding the concept of us living in a simulation because I build simulations all the time.
Right.
And being a person who builds simulations, you have a different perspective on what it's like for the simulated characters to exist in their simulated world.
That's true.
And,
You develop their entire scope of understanding of what the world is.
right. And so there's a lot of interesting concepts that parallel our world and the world that we live in. And one of the more unique ones is the idea of random chance.
Mm-hmm.
So in my game that I make, we make a football game that hits these 22 players on the field and they run around and do their things. Well, there is the element of random chance that comes into playing that game, in the sense that if a ball is thrown and a player happens to deflect it, and then suddenly the physics system takes control of the ball and what it's doing, at that point, it's unpredictable. Is that guy going to intercept it? Is this guy going to intercept it? Is it going to fall to the ground? Is another guy on the same team going to catch it and run it for a touchdown?
Mm-hmm.
I can't predict what will happen. I can only just sit back and watch. Right? Which is a really interesting concept, because here I am as a developer. I have complete control over every aspect of how this game is made, what goes into it, the logic behind it, the physics system that's chosen. I even can go in and I can change these properties at any given moment. And if I build the game in such a way, I can even pause time, change a particular property, and then restart time, and I can suddenly make the ball 10 times heavier.
Yeah.
And watch it suddenly be flying midair and then just go pop, because it's now got 10 times the mass. All of these things are possibilities of things that I can do as a game developer. But when I keep coming back to this idea of random chance, it's just really interesting, because even though I have the ability to debug the game, to pause the game, to set the animations that are played, control the stats of a particular player, all of these aspects that basically make up the game, as soon as I set it in motion, I lose some of my control of being able to predict the future.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
So I don't know if that ball is going to get deflected once the play starts.
Right.
And even if I did have the ability to know every last little thing that's going to happen, there's still the element of random chance. Like, I don't know if the randomizer is going to pick the random animation of the lineman who's going to jump up in the air and put his hand up. Because he may do it or he may not. There's random chance involved in it. So even though I can know all of the potential outcomes of what my game can do, I don't know the exact one that will happen, which is very, very fascinating. Like, I know every animation that every player can play, and I know what the impact of the physics system will have on each one of those animations and what each player can possibly do. Like, I know if I take this running back with this weight, run it into this lineman with this weight, that this running back is going to get squished.
Oh, that's interesting. So weight really plays into it and everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Momentum and mass and stuff like that.
Wind?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
So, like, when you kick the football,
Wow,
it's
interesting.
rolling really hard, it'll move the football.
Very cool.
So in a sense, the randomizer is like free will in our world, because you don't always know what choice is going to be made, but you can always foresee what the results of the choices might be. Right? And the other thing that's really interesting is that if you were to try and diagram it out, of like, here's you moving along, and then suddenly you have a decision point. Well, maybe the decision point is as simple as yes or no. So then it splits. But then the outcomes of the yes or no can split and split and split and split and split and split for an infinite amount of potential choices. So it's also interesting to see how one choice can lead to an infinite set of possibilities.
True.
So there's just some interesting ideas to reflect from my perspective of making the game versus the idea of living in a simulation. And then the article that we read where it said that, rest assured, this is not a simulation
Right.
that we're living in, which I agree with. But my counterpoint to it is, the only thing that they were able to prove is that there is not some sort of computer running in whatever level 0 universe that exists, right? So let's say you're in level 0 universe, which means you're not in a simulation.
Right.
And they build a computer that can make a simulation, and we're living and running inside that simulation. So all they've proven is that that's not possible, because there's not enough atoms in the universe to represent the amount of memory and processing power you would need to process every single last simulation. So that's what the article that I read said.
But how do they know that the level 0 universe doesn't have that capability?
Exactly. And that was what my point was.
Yeah, because they're not, it wouldn't make sense for the thing that needs to simulate this universe be in this universe.
Right.
And who knows what the rules outside of it would be.
That's exactly my point too.
Okay.
And I think the bias comes from the naturalistic viewpoint.
Oh.
They can't come up with a different way to create the universe, right?
That's interesting. Yes, you're right. The naturalistic viewpoint doesn't really take into consideration anything outside the universe.
Or a designer / creator.
Exactly.
So therefore, there can be nothing else other than this type of universe. There can be multiverses of this universe, but they should all be roughly of the same type, right?
That's intriguing. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. I would have
So-
thought that generic statement about outside the universe would have fallen into a naturalistic worldview. But you're exactly right; it does not, because that's supernatural just by definition.
Yep.
Okay.
So when we think about it that way, we could still be running in a simulation, but the computer / device that the simulation is being run on
Mm-hmm.
has to exist in a universe that has physical properties that would allow for this to exist,
Exactly.
right? So whatever that might be, let's just call it the heavenly realm for an easy way to visualize it and think about it. Then in that heavenly realm, maybe there is like trans-dimensional processors that can get something processed in the heavenly cloud or whatever, figure out what needs to
I like
happen
that,
on
the
it.
cloud, because the heavenly cloud.
Because maybe it takes so much time to simulate, just me waving my hand and all the air molecules flowing around from it, that they have to offload that work to another dimension just so that it can happen over there over a super long time. But because that dimension just happens to be running at a super fast rate compared to the heavenly dimension, then you can get the results back almost instantly and then feed it right back into the simulation. The other thing that's really interesting about our world not being in a simulation is that if there was any sort of, if it really was a simulation that was being controlled by some sort of computational device, then you would think that eventually at some point, if you overloaded the simulation with too much movement, too many things to process, that you should be able to see a frame rate drop, just like we do in the game, right? And that should be...
Now, here's a question, though. If there was a frame rate drop, would we be able to detect it as parts of those frames?
That's a really good point. And I would think that no, if you were in the frame rate drop, you wouldn't. However, you would expect that someone over here, observing someone else that's stuck in the frame rate drop, you would think that they would be able to observe each other looking different. Now, maybe
I was thinking the frame rate drop would apply to the entire universe.
that's how we think of our current development,
Yeah.
like of making a game, right?
Yeah.
Because the entire frame has to run. I would think that if you're building this kind of simulation, it might not necessarily work out like that. But if you think about it, the frame rate drop is kind of equivalent to looking at the speed of light.
Like reference frames?
Yeah, because the faster you go, the slower time gets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're living through fewer frames.
That's true.
So, let's say I'm living at 30 frames per second, and every frame, I'm losing 1/30th of my life to that particular second. Well, if you're traveling at the speed of light and you're only taking 1 frame for that entire 30 seconds, well, that means I've only lived 1/29th of my life at light speed versus normal speed. Because there's only 1 frame to update everything that's running on my life process.
You live longer if you're traveling at the speed of light. Relatively speaking, yes. Yeah. Relatively, you live longer. You don't know that you are.
Right.
But everyone else would say, man, he lives for 1,000 years. Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. I don't think that's provable by any measurable state, but it's an interesting kind of just to think about. It's like it's fun. It tickles the brain.
Yes.
To think about this kind of thing.
Mental gymnastics.
Right. But I still think my point is valid that just like if I were to make my video game exists simply of a stadium with players, big crowd, people in it, right? It's a pretty poor simulation, to be honest, compared to what we have in real life. Even though we call it a simulation football game because it's trying to recreate what real life football is.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of it is that it's, it's all a farce that's barely constructed just to the point so that you as the player are to believe you're in the simulation, right?
Because like I bet, and I'm assuming that you probably don't have fully realized, like 25,000 fully realized attendees that could independently do actions at any given time.
Right.
I'm assuming that's not the case.
Right.
And so, yeah, imagine if you did have to do that, which you would in a reality scenario. Yeah.
And even your best, most amazing open world games, like I was going to show on the Switch, Zelda, can only do the things that the game allows you to do. So even though it is open world, you can do an amazing amount of things that you have never been able to do in a Zelda game in the past. You're so extremely limited to what you truly can do.
Well, and you could probably even talk a little bit about, and again, you know way more than me, but the fact that things that aren't in the player's frame of view aren't necessarily active, right? So like for example, the stuff behind me doesn't have to render until I turn around.
You know, necessarily simulate.
Right.
Even though
it depends on the type of game. Like if there's systems that are always running, then they have to always run. But certainly if it's a mostly visual game, then you wouldn't necessarily have to render anything behind you.
So like it's interesting, right? Because the enemy behind me still has to simulate.
That's true. In that kind of game, yeah.
Because obviously, if you turn around, you shouldn't just freeze in time.
Right.
Right.
No, of course.
So that's really interesting because now you have this thing that's happening behind the scenes from what the players experience. But here's another really interesting thought to play off of that one. I think it was one of the presentations that you showed where the guy was talking about how every single person who's born is like another view on the universe. Like they're recreating the universe every single moment that they have their eyes open and they're looking at it.
Oh, right. That's Hoffman. Yeah.
Has to take all of the light that bounces off all of the surfaces back, reflect it off the retina, and then take all of that information and process an image from it.
Right.
So every single person that's alive is literally recreating the universe in their brain.
That's exactly right.
However fast our brains can process it.
Right.
Let's say it's 60 frames per second. So in a way, that kind of equates to the camera in the game.
Sure.
Because I can only process the light that makes it to my eyes. I can't process any of the stuff that's happening back there.
Exactly.
But it's still simulating.
Yeah. I can see it.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's interesting.
So then that's another problem for the computational computer that's running the simulation that we're living in. Because every new person that you're adding, well, now they have to be able to process. Basically, it's like adding another camera into the game and rendering it from that perspective.
Exactly.
So you have more people all rendering the game all at the same time. You just look at it and you're just like, this doesn't really seem to add up.
Yeah. Well,
There's so many challenges.
the video that you saw was Donald Hoffman talking about interface theory, but then he also goes on to talk more in other videos about his I don't remember what he calls it, but he has this theory that's about networks of conscious agents, is what I believe he calls it. And it's kind of like what you said. It's like the entire, he's focused more on the perception of individuals rather than the physical reality that they're all seeing. And he's saying, we have these networks of conscious agents that are basically creating, like you're saying, in our brains, the reality that we see, and we have to agree on it, And so it's just another interesting talk he does.
But what's really interesting, right, is that if it's a simulation, then you would expect objectivity across the board. So you would expect that we can both see the same chair.
Right.
Because theoretically, it should be the same program that's running in our brains to perceive and process that chair. So when you start to get into situations where you have someone who has a mental disorder and they don't see this chair,
right?
They see it as some threatening thing, then what's going on in the simulation that's causing that, right?
Right. I mean, even sensory disabilities. Someone who can't see, the dog might be able to perceive it through, hearing or smell, whereas we can see it, but we can't smell it or hear it, because we're just not attuned to it. So different systems within the simulation are like tuning themselves to optimize the limitations or counteract limitations of the individual observer.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
So perception is not uniform.
I think there is a chance that we are living in God's simulation, but I think I'm biased to think that way because I am a video game developer. And it's easy for me to relate to that concept.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that God is living in a dimension, in a universe one up from ours, and he somehow can, just like he's a college student in his universe, and he just downloaded the latest Earth Sim 5.0.
Right.
And he's just running it and, having fun watching the game play. Like, I don't think he's playing The Sims.
Yeah, The Sims. That's what immediately jumped to mind was The Sims.
Up in his universe. Like, I don't think it's like that. But I like the concept of the simulation because God has lots of the same abilities that I do as a developer.
Mm-hmm.
So omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence.
Omniscience with limitations.
Yeah.
As you described it.
So you look at all of those abilities that he has, and it's just like, that totally equates to how I look at it when I make the game.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to go in and suddenly change a guy's appearance, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So then, when I think of it that way, I'm like, well, if God has all of these agents running around in his world that have free will, but then there are creatures in the world that don't have free will, like animals, insects. So let's just...
They're just operating on a rudimentary program.
Yeah, let's just assume for the moment that they don't have free will.
Okay.
That they've just been pre-programmed to do what they do. Like, they're basically robots, like really smart robots.
Mm-hmm.
They can react to change in the environments and things that have happened, but they're always going to do the same thing every single time. There's no way for them to do something that wasn't programmed for them.
That's how you explain cats. Just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah, that's why they always stays that.
It's like they don't learn.
So what's interesting then is, does that mean that God is still actively involved with tuning and dialing in all of the non-free will parts of his universe? So is he going in and he's actively controlling how nature responds to pollution and how animals respond to humanity? Like maybe when the earth was first created and there were a few humans around, he made the animals less violent towards humans so that they would be less likely to eat them all up and that you would die off really fast.
Hmm.
And then as there became more and more humans, he actually dialed up the violence on the animals so that the humans would still be somewhat, like they wouldn't think that, oh, well, that tiger's so tame, I'm just going to walk right up to it and, kill it so easily and steal its fur or whatever. I believe that God still wants the diversification of his creation in the world. I don't think he wants humanity to go and wipe it out, even though we still have dominion over it, based off of what the Bible says.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just this interesting idea, like, can he go in and change these things based off of what the free will agents are doing in the universe?
Just modify the parameters
Yeah.
at runtime.
Right. It's like, if he suddenly wants a certain creature to reproduce faster, he certainly, as the developer, has that ability to suddenly, crank that up. And it's just really interesting because we haven't had a long history of observing the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So he could have very well done that. And now that we're at the point where we're measuring and watching those kind of things, and we're like, okay, we know that rabbits reproduce at exactly this rate.
Mm-hmm.
So if suddenly they were doubling that rate for no reason that we could measure, we'd be like, what just happened, right? We would know
Mm-hmm.
that somebody was meddling with how the properties of the simulation.
Hmm.
But you could also just do it in such a subtle way that we would never know. Like you could figure over 100 years.
So that's similar to the discussion I had, brief discussion, with Danny, which was with regard to his view of, like, I don't know what he calls it. I'm sure there's a term, something like intermittent creation or something like that.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Progressive creation, is that it? Progressive,
Yeah.
I think.
That's where God basically comes in and sprinkles. new
Yes,
things.
exactly. And I think that's Danny's view. And what I was trying to say was that, but why would that be required? Because you could create the simulation in our discussion, to be sophisticated enough to know how to respond in a given situation and to say, okay, now it's time to, it doesn't require someone to come in and change it interactively is what I was trying to get at. And I think in what you were describing about the active tweaking of these parameters, again, if the population of the rabbits are decreasing too quickly, then all of a sudden their reproduction dials up. It could be programmed in. It doesn't require intervention, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very true. It's like he could have easily programmed it to be that way.
Yeah.
Or if he wants to pause the simulation with it, because when the simulation pauses, we have no idea.
No, exactly.
Like right now, 1 billion years could have gone by. God's not.
You wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know.
Exactly.
Or he can pause the simulation, go in, update the parameter that says how fast rabbits can reproduce at, and then start it up again.
You know what that reminds me of is those perplexing scenes in Westworld. Did you watch Westworld?
I never watched it, but I know the concept.
Yeah, because they kept having scenes where all of a sudden the robots would be just paused and the technicians would be doing something, and then they would resume it later. and it was like, I mean, I couldn't understand if they'd taken the robot somewhere else and then put it back, or if they'd done it right there in place. I couldn't quite understand that, but still, it was the idea of they pause it and then resume it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny because they couldn't pause if they had shot a bullet in midair.
That's true, but in God's simulation, he could.
He could.
Yeah.
So then, I think I might have had one or two other thoughts. So yeah, I talked about being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And then I said that as a game developer, I potentially only have 1 to 2 of those abilities. Because I'm definitely omnipotent. I have the power to do anything I want.
Right.
Like that is certainly not a problem. You might be able to argue that I'm omniscient because I have complete or unlimited knowledge to perceive all things that is happening in the simulation.
Mm-hmm.
But where it gets a little bit tricky is when random chance gets thrown in.
Right.
Because then at that point I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I have it to a degree, but not to the sense that I know exactly the features that's going to happen.
You have it, like going back to that one other analogy I did, is that you have it to the degree of the author of the Choose Your Own Adventure book, but the author of the Choose Your Own Adventure book can't say what any given reader at any given time, what ending they're going to choose, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like that. It's like you have the knowledge, all the knowledge, but in any given person's conscious experience, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen next.
But the thing I definitely don't have is omnipresence. I can't be everywhere in the game at every moment because I'm still stuck to my human limitation.
Mm-hmm.
I can only watch this player throwing the ball at this moment. I can't watch what's happening up in the stands with that particular fan doing whatever he's doing at that moment, plus the 50,000, 100,000 other fans all at the same time.
See, I think I would argue the definition of the word omnipresent, because do you mean you are physically in all places at the same time, or could it qualify as just being aware of all places at any given time? Because if you're aware of all places at any given time, then we can go back to the idea of pausing the simulation and say, okay, well, if from God's perspective, it was such a slow frame rate that he's watching, he can literally see everything that's happening at any given moment. And he is everywhere in that he witnesses everything. But I don't know if that's the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough because I kind of thought of it that way too. That you kind of just change the perspective a little bit. But then you have to think about it from the perspective of, in our world, when you go home and I go home, let's say we both went home and then we prayed. Well, God has to be able to hear both of our prayers at the same time, or if you want to argue, be in our presence through the Holy Spirit at both of our places at the same time, then I can't do that in my game, right? Like I can't, like if there were two active players, let's say it's not a football game, let's say it's a multiplayer game.
Oh.
I don't have the ability to be where the person is playing over here on the map and where the person is playing over here on the map at the same time. Sure, I can pause the game and I can go and see where this guy is on this frame and this guy is on that frame. But as soon as I unpause the game, I'm not going to be able to follow both of them at the same time because of my human.
Yes, yeah, okay. That's what I was wondering if you were going to throw in. Yeah, I think that's because of your human limitation, though.
Right. So, but it's an interesting thought, though, to put back to our Creator God watching his simulation. If he does somehow have the ability to be everywhere all at the same time and perceive all things all at the same time, that's just mind-boggling.
Well, of
right?
course, yeah, definitely.
Because it also means that his ability to perceive and be everywhere at the same time scales up to any scale it needs to be, right? Because when it first started out, there were only 2 people, and it only had to work for 2. Now it works for technically over 7 billion, right? So that is amazing by itself. And then you think, okay, well, what if he's just paused time, and now he processes all 7 billion people and whatever. Let's say all 7 billion people prayed that day, and he processes all their prayers. Makes a chart, figures out who gets what, whose prayers are answered, and whose are not, and then puts all of it in place, and then restarts the simulation. Then you think about the amount of time that it would take a being with the limitations of a being living in our universe. It seems impossible.
Well, but I think it's more like the scenario that you mentioned earlier, where like you could have a dimension that runs for 1 billion years and it gives you back the output a minute later. I think it's more like that. It would be like he could process those 7 billion people or whatever, but keep going because it's just like that.
Right. That's what it's kind of interesting, and it definitely points back to the creator of this universe needing to be truly omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent to live up to the characteristics. Because if we are a simulation living in somebody else's universe that has fantastic properties, even the concept of them being able to deal with that just doesn't seem plausible. Which is give whatever the universes that is running the computer that we're living in right now, like give that universe any properties you want, you're still kind of running into that bound by time limitation.
I mean, I have a hard time with that because I think that we're projecting too much of our own limitations onto God. We're saying, well, because I can't imagine this, then it's obviously not possible.
Yeah.
But so what if I can't imagine it? I think that if the nature of this super universe or whatever we call it is so wildly different than ours, then who's to say?
Well, I only think that it's in the naturalistic point of we're living in the simulation of another universe's product. So,
well, oh, you're saying if the other universe is similar in most ways to ours?
yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then, yeah. No, you have a good point there. If it's bound by similar rules of physics and laws like that, then yeah, you're right.
Even if you want to bend the rules of physics and
Right.
certain stuff like that, just like you can bend them as much as you want. I still think that so long as you haven't bent them to the point where reality can't exist anymore,
Right.
I think it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to scale up their ability to deal with everything that's happening in the simulation.
Mm-hmm.
Just like as me as a game developer, the more players I add into my game, the harder it is for me as the developer watching all these players play to make sure that things are going right. I get less and less time on each person to be able to handle all of that, and eventually, things are going to start to break, and bugs are going to start, sneaking into the product that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting all the players to all stand on top of each other, so this one guy at the very top could sniper shoot everybody from a certain vantage point.
Right. That was always possible, but I did not expect that.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting little fun thought experiment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had this funny little Reddit post that I found where someone had described their life as being an NPC in a role-playing game.
Oh.
Because and I was going to show in Zelda like running into these NPCs.
Right.
They say the same thing every single time.
Right.
And they're very limited in what they can do. And this person's like, yeah, that's totally my life. Like, I just go to the same box every day, pretty much say the same thing every day.
Yep.
And, get angry when these kids come by and screw up my lawn or something.
Right, right.
So that was kind of funny. And so then talked about free will a little bit more, where I was saying, so I wrote this down in a paragraph and I was planning to read it out loud like this. Free will is a construct that must be framed by the one granting the free will. This is because those who are within the simulation cannot ascertain from within if they have free will or not.
Right.
It does not matter how much we argue for or against it. Only God, or the creator or designer of the simulation, knows the truth, and it's their choice to reveal it to us or not.
That's very succinct and correct, I think.
All right, man.
All right, take it easy.
I'm going to take off.
Yeah, I couldn't.
See you next time.